Thanks for joining us, folks. We're about to start the afternoon portion, and with that, I will hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks for everyone for joining us again for the remainder of the presentation on our draft final proposal for our tax structure enhancements initiative. Earlier, we were going over some of the examples of how the net settlements invoicing process would work in the prior slides. We're going to move on a little bit more, got a couple more details about the implementation of the hybrid billing determinant proposal that we want to touch on. So let's jump into that. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know. One moment. There we go. Thank you. Okay, so let's get back into it with this slide on slide 35, starting back up again. This one is not any change from prior proposals, but did want to touch on this implementation detail. So one of the things that was requested from stakeholder comments was how would the ISO update the TRR when there was any changes to the rates that would be necessary, and so we just wanted to clarify and explain how this process would work. And the idea here is that we would continue to do intra-year updates to the rates whenever there is an updated TRR filing provided by the PTOs once those are, approved by the ALJ or the settlement judge or whatever process ultimately approves those TRR updates. So that happens today, and that's as you'll know if you go and look at our TAC rate worksheets on the settlements page for the high voltage TAC rates, you'll see that there's some updates throughout the year. It doesn't always stay exactly the same, and that's because of this update that we have intra-year as new facilities are included into certain PTOs, TRRs, and the TRR number changes, then we update the rates accordingly throughout the year. Like that. Excuse me. So the idea here is that we would continue to do that for this proposed hybrid billing determinant proposal where, the TRR amounts would still be updated. Also, if the rate case forecasts are updated, so for the volumetric piece that we're going to use forecast data, that does change again as well today, and so we would continue to do that updating if necessary throughout the year, if that is the case. And then the last bullet here is just to note that again we're going to do the TRR bifurcation process with the system-wide load factor calculation. We're only going to do that at the start of the annual period, as we noted in the previous slides, but the idea here is that won't be updated throughout the year. So that's just kind of giving an overview of what will be changing throughout the year as the ISO receives new numbers from PTOs, and then what we think would need to stay consistent. And the idea here with this bifurcation being only established and set throughout the year is to continue to reflect that prior historic periods system load factor, so that we can actually continue to reflect that amount of the TRR that should be calculated and collected under the volumetric versus the peak demand component. So that is that on that slide. Let's keep going through this. So what kind of data are we going to utilize for settlements under this proposal? We continue to believe that the utilization of gross load settlement data is going to be appropriate to determine the volumetric usage, and then as well as the hourly average peak demand use for that 12 CP observation of each UDC area's demand use. So the idea is use the hourly data that's currently provided through our settlements process, and then through that we would identify at the end of the month when that coincident peak monthly coincident hour was, and that's how we would apply the 12 CP rate would be to the hourly average demand for each of those UDC areas. So that is kind of the overview of the data set that we would utilize, and so it does line up pretty well with the way that we do things currently, so there isn't going to be a new type of metering or measurement or anything like that. We can just glean that information from our settlements process that we currently have. Okay, any questions about either updating the TRR or updating the rates throughout the year or anything on this data that we would use for settlements? All right. No change there from the prior proposals, so it should be pretty straightforward. And then now we're going to move on slide 37 here. We're going to talk about the proposal for aligning the WAC billing determinants, the wheeling access charge billing determinant structure for the non-PTO entities that are included within the kind of the internal entities to the ISO, even though they are not necessarily in the balancing authority area and they take WAC, they actually are planned for and served by the transmission system similarly to other internal loads. So we are planning to adopt an approach that aligns the WAC billing determinant structure with the proposed treatment for traditional PTO UDCs under the traditional high voltage TAC. And so the reason for that, again, is we think that it's very similar to how the loads are treated in the transition planning process, and that it is the right thing to do for these internal entities that are billed under the WAC process rather than the normal traditional TAC that other PTOs and UDCs are billed under. So how would we do that? The idea here is to really ultimately have three separate type of wheeling access charge rates, applying, you know, the similar approach that we would do for the high voltage TAC rates to how we would do that for these non-PTO entities under this proposal. And generally all the stakeholder feedback we got was supportive of this. There was no one who raised any major concerns, which is good because we feel that this is a pretty widely supported part of the proposal because of that. And also, you know, just wanted to go through how these rates would actually look just compare and contrast basically how we have it today. This part of the proposal ultimately results in three separate and distinct parts of the wheeling access charge rates. So the first part of this that I'm going to talk about here, listed as number 1 on this slide, 39, is the volumetric wheeling access charge rates for traditional exports and wheeling transactions. So what does that mean? That is essentially we're going to keep the same billing structure with only a volumetric billing determinant for traditional exports and wheeling transactions. So that will be calculated currently the same way as it's done today, with using the full overall annual TRR for the high voltage system and the sum of all of the PTO's approved gross load forecast, and that's how we'll determine the rate for that. That will continue to be charged to all traditional exports and wheeling customers as it is today, and so that part basically just stays the same. So anybody who's outside of the ISO balancing area is going to continue to see the same type of rate as they do today. Obviously, it will adjust for the TRR and the amount of load that the system uses, but that's the idea behind this part of the rate. Now, okay, I'll pause it there and go back to the room for a question. Paul, go ahead.
So, Paul with Klika. So just for absolute clarity on this, so today what the transmission access charge and the wheeling rate are saved, it's about, what, $12?
Give or take right now.
Give or take. Under the hybrid, that volumetric under the TAC would say drop in half, just throwing out numbers. I think what you're saying here is for an export, it's still going to be closer to $12, not drop.
That's right, because it'll be based off of 100% of the HV-TRR, not the split amount of the TRR that it would be applied to for the other two components of this new wheeling access charge rate. So we keep the rate today for all the traditional exporters and wheelers that we have going on right now, besides these non-PTO entities that are like an internal load, which would be like, for instance, NCPA and some of the other MSS areas similar to, CDWR, I believe, and others that might take this kind of service this way. And so for those entities, they will be treated similar to the hybrid billing determinant approach that we are proposing for the traditional TAC. So what does that really mean? Basically, it'll have a volumetric component, and then also on the next slide here, the 12CP demand rate component, and those will each be charged to these entities similarly to any other UDC. The difference really here is that these, since they don't have transmission and they don't go through at least they don't have transmission costs that are being allocated and recovered through the ISO's TAC charges, they would be essentially just treated like how they are today, where they take service based off of the rates that are calculated to serve the rest of the load. So again, these two slides here are just explaining that the billing determinant amount for that volumetric will be based off of that split TRR that we do at the beginning of the year, similar to the regular TAC that we're going to do that for, and then the sum, using the sum of the gross load forecast, and that's basically, it'll be the same exact rate as the one for the TAC volumetric that we're proposing under this change. And then again, similarly, same thing with the 12CP demand rate. Again, we'd be using that split TRR under the system load factor calculation, and then using all the PTO's annualized demand forecast megawatts to determine what that rate would be. So entities like these non-PTO internal load basically are going to be treated similarly to how any other UDC would be treated, with the billing structure being based on volumetric and 12CP components. Now, I just want to kind of provide a bit more justification on this, because we did get some questions from stakeholders saying, how is it fair to be charging different amounts for the exports as it is for these other wheeling services? And essentially, the reasoning behind that is that we don't want to create a new type of transmission service where we'd have to have reservations or some type of other service for exports where we would be able to measure that peak demand, because obviously as an exporter, you're not going to have the same type of a monthly peak demand as you would if you were an LSE, because you can just simply determine on these peak periods we won't utilize the transmission because we don't need to export at that point. And the whole intent of this is to try to reflect cost causation and benefits that are being provided, and the idea really is that the system isn't built for exporting. The system is built to serve internal load. Exports obviously naturally occur because there's excess capability on the system, and that's why we think it's appropriate to continue to use the volumetric approach for those entities. Questions, comments, anybody? We'll go here and then Doug after.
And I guess
Doug first, okay.
For the
that's fine.
For the non-PTO entities, that would continue to be measured at the substation at the boundary.
That's right. Yep. Jan?
So just curious, when is the ISO going to take up the question of whether there should even be a wheeling export charge in the first instance?
Not under this initiative.
I know, so I'm just a little off subject, but I'm just curious. It's been, because I've heard DMM weigh in on the same point, and I think they're kind of the same view we have, which is there really shouldn't be one.
Well, I think it really depends on the particular situation or hypothetical that you're talking about, if there should or shouldn't be. But we did not take a strong look at that issue under this TAC initiative. So, and that was part of the scoping that we talked about. So while this issue does touch on the wheeling access charge, again, as we go back to this slide here, again, we're saying we're not touching how we do anything for the traditional exports, and so that's really the difference. And your point's well taken that we may need to look at the way that we do this traditional wheeling access charge for exports, but at this point that's not under the scope of this initiative, and I think those kind of issues are captured under our annual catalog, stakeholder initiative catalog process. So it's not that we're totally ignoring that issue or anything like that. We are going to, obviously continue with the traditional categorization and ranking of the priorities of working on those kind of issues. So I don't have a good sense of if that'll be taken up next year or in 5 years or when, but I think, if enough entities are saying that that's a serious issue to consider, that will raise itself up to something that we need to take a look at. David?
David Oliver, Navigant. May not know the answer to this. Do you know if the Market Surveillance Committee is going to provide an opinion on this proposal?
That's a good question. So I think that we are not asking them to provide an opinion. Is that right, John? Do you remember for sure about that on the MFC? I think we were just going to ask them to review the proposal and then provide informal comments or something, but not write like a full. Yeah, we're not having a formal opinion from the MSC on this. All right. Any further discussion on these non-PTO entities and wheeling access charge stuff? Okay. So we didn't get a lot of pushback on this, so that was good to hear. Pretty broad support on this component of the proposal. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping things up, so let's talk through this cost impact analysis issues a little bit further. Sorry. Go ahead, David. Yeah, sure.
I'm not really sure if it matters or not, but will the revenue? Does it matter how the revenues are applied from exports to which half of the TRR, or does it not matter? Like, are you?
Good question. It shouldn't matter. So the idea is that the wheeling access charge revenues from traditional exports and these other entities will just offset the total TRR amount that's to be collected in the next year. So that's how that would work, and then that would be applied to that full amount before we did the bifurcation. Now, that is a good point. Maybe if there was a larger chunk of this that was collected under the 12CP rate, then we could apply that to just the next year's 12CP component. But at this point, we believe that that's not necessary. That's just an extra step that we don't need to take. That might actually align the true usage of the system, the way that those folks are benefiting from, those customers are benefiting from those different components a little bit closer than just applying it to the full TR. I think that's a fair statement to make, but the ISO doesn't see that would be that big of a difference. And I think that really, for the majority of the exports, the stuff that's collected under wheeling access charge, that's all going to be under the traditional, which is still going to be all volumetric. So that's why we think it's appropriate for the whole bucket of TRR to just be reduced by the full amount that's collected under both these components of the wheeling access charge. All right. Doug? On the line? Okay. Let's go to the phones. Sam, are you on there? Operator, if you... Oh, go ahead.
Great. Thanks. I think you're just getting to this issue, but it's all my coalition. Well, I think that the concept of applying the hybrid approach to both PTO and non-PTO utilities makes perfect sense. You mentioned that it would be measured in the same way, and we agree that to the extent that you are applying it to gross load, in both cases that's the same. But it is important to point out that the way gross load is calculated relative to the customers of non-PTOs versus PTOs is different. And so you're actually looking at if you're applying the demand charge and measuring that for the non-PTOs, you'll be measuring the demand at the TV interface. And that means that where you have both behind the meter and in front of the meter storage and DG, as well as energy efficiency measures in that area, or demand response in that area, that's all going to count for the non-PTOs, where only the behind the meter changes will count for the PTOs.
Yep. Thanks for that comment, Tom, and clarification there. That is the case, yeah. So the fact that those entities are essentially KISO-metered entities that take service at their city gate or their TD interface point, depending on the particular entity. The terminology may be a little bit different, but the ultimate impact is as you described. So in those entities, if they had in front of the meter DG or other types of impacts that would reduce their overall gross load, that would reduce their overall charges here. So that is that we discussed a bit. Sorry, go ahead.
Including the demand charges. That was the only point I wanted to clarify.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. That's right. Volumetric or demand. So yeah, if it reduces their gross load number, then it would reduce that volumetric component, and then if it was to reduce their coincident peak demand as well on that demand charge side, that would also reduce their allocation of cost. So we got another question in the room here. Go ahead, Bert.
This is Bert Hansen from Southern California Edison. Just to make sure I'm understanding, this would not be gross load for a wheeling entity that is, let's say, either outside the ISO or within the ISO, subsumed within somewhat the wheeling exports. True?
Yeah, so that's a good clarification. So my language usage there was wrong. It is not the gross load for these entities. It is essentially their net load at their city gate or their metering point that they take service from.
Because there's another stakeholder process looking right.
That's right. And similarly to this, we're saying in that proceeding as well, called excess behind meter production, that those entities are already treated that way due to pre-existing arrangements and should not have a separate addition of having to do a different treatment, as we're trying to clarify for these other UDC PTO areas that have that take service and are basing their gross load figures off of their end-use customer meters. So there is a difference there, and the ISO acknowledges that, and we're continuing to support that is an appropriate differentiation. Go ahead, Jan.
So I guess just to follow up on that a little bit, and this is the other proceeding, which probably isn't the right place to ask the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is, when you define gross load for those kinds of entities, is it going to be defined in terms of their interface with their host utility rather than their end-use meter customers?
Yeah, so that's right, I believe.
So in other words, gross load will have a different meaning depending on which UDC you are.
Well, the definition of gross load will only be applied to entities that have the treatment of the end-use customer meters. And then the other entities necessarily are KISO-metered entities, and they essentially are getting this netting treatment that we've been discussing already.
Okay,
and they have been getting that treatment, and they will continue to get that treatment. And
right.
We're not saying that they will be needing to add back in their excess behind the meter production or anything like that.
Understood. Well, I guess what I'm asking is, when you get a formal definition for gross load finalized, what I'm hearing you say is that that doesn't apply to those sorts of entities. It only
That's
applies.
Right.
Okay.
That's right. And in that parallel proceeding, I don't want to talk about it too much today, but in that parallel proceeding, in the definition of gross load that we have incorporated there, we do have caveats that say this does not apply to metered subsystems, this does not apply to these other entities with pre-existing arrangements, and so we need to clarify that specifically in that initiative, but that's the intent. So there is some different treatment here, and what Sam said and what Bert had said, that is the case. That is what the ISO acknowledges, that there will be a bit of different treatment for some of these entities. All right. Let's keep going and talk a little bit about this impact now. Okay, no, wait. Before we get away from that, go ahead, Doug.
Oh.
Okay. Hey, this is your last chance on the stakeholder process, so go for it.
At least in this one, right?
Yeah. For now.
And so the rationale for that distinction between the non-PTOs and the PTO UDCs is basically that's how it's done historically, but there's not any sort of a priori conceptual much rationale behind it.
Right. Theoretically, I think that the ISO wouldn't say that there's a particular rate-making theory that says that they have to be treated that way. I think it's more of a function of that was the agreement that we utilized to have those entities become part of the ISO or become taking service through the ISO's transmission operations. And as part of that, they have some different things. Some of them don't have metering that actually has the capability to provide some of the stuff that we're talking about in those other in that other proceeding, where they don't really know how much excess production is even occurring. And so the ISO is really not keen on getting into the business of forcing, new infrastructure to be built by, smaller PTOs or municipals that may not, whose board didn't approve those kind of expenditures and things like that. So there's a lot of history that goes into why we're not applying that. The principles, and, we may even agree with some of the stakeholder comments that perhaps the principals would say that they should be treated differently, but at this point, consistently trying to state that we don't believe that this proposal should be applied, in a similar manner in that instance of the metering and net treatment versus gross load treatment there. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, David Oliver, Navigant. I'm pretty sure, and maybe this can be confirmed, but the planning process doesn't consider the gross load, like the load inside. That's right,
in those areas, yeah. So they're similarly treated to an internal load, but it is at that net load amount that's in that at that point of measurement that they have for this, these entities. So the other point beyond that is that, that I think some of the entities like NCPA had mentioned in their comments, and I don't want to, say that this is exactly what they said, so this is just my interpretation, but is that they've had to build out their distribution system, and since they only have one LSE in their area, there's really no impact from any other LSE's procurement decisions in their area, and they are the ones, their ratepayers share the burden of all the decisions to be made that they have made to procure either distribution system resources behind the meter or wholesale level resources. And so those entities actually are experiencing the true full cost of those decisions, which would be different from a traditional UDC area that has multiple LSEs within it. So that there is a bit of different treatment there, and that's one of the major reasons why there's a distinct treatment here. Go ahead, Jan.
So I guess I just want a little historical perspective. My recollection back when the ISO was formed, and this question came up about metered subsystems, was that there was no reason to do it other than that certain entities wanted it, and we, as a matter of compromise, I think we agreed to set it up. I don't think any of us anticipated the degree to which you'd have behind the meter generation or distribution level generation, and that wasn't really part of the calculus when that decision was made.
That's right.
So I guess my point being that I don't think you can read into that much of a precedent.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so to agree for them to still continue to take service through this new entity to the ISO, they agreed that they would continue that kind of same treatment, getting that, city gate type delivery of the energy there. And I think, on top of that, the idea that you're right, that we did not anticipate this much explosion of behind the meter growth. And so there may be impacts there. But that is really the reason why we're also saying, hey, we need to adjust this treatment for the wheeling access charge here to align with the rest of this proposal so that we at least can capture how much they're really contributing to the coincident peak demand, even if it is in that netting, at that netting amount of the load that get that treatment for. So that's really the reasoning behind that position here on the proposal ultimately. Anybody else want to touch on that further? All right. Well, I think that was good to try to talk through that so everybody's aware of the history and why where we are on that one. Let's talk more about this impact analysis I was trying to get to. So, again, we provided some analysis in the paper and the proposal itself that explains all the impacts that we see that we did through Brattle helped us make a cost impact analysis model. stakeholders had some question about the sensitivities, wanted us to do some more, so we provided a bunch of different stuff in the actual proposal. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but it ultimately shows that, these are really, there's not a huge impact to any particular area. There's some stuff that's going to happen, and it's really all, based on future measurements of demand and the TRR and all that, so we did caveat that heavily. And ultimately, one of the things that we did in that analysis was we had to do a load profiling technique, which was actually one of the reasons why there might be some discrepancy. Some of the smaller PTOs said, hey, this doesn't look right. They wanted us to explain it a little bit better and provide some more analysis. So we looked at their individual actual data and provided that to them separately because that was all confidential. But ultimately, the idea is that the impact analysis isn't really 100% accurate just because of this idea that we had to do load profiling. So all the smaller entities that are embedded within like the FCE territory have had that kind of load profiling technique applied to them. So why are we bringing that up right now? Well, since the stakeholders asked for this phase-in period, the ISO kind of thinks, okay, that's appropriate to talk a little bit more about that. So we said, hey, we'll do a phase-in period for this, and then talk about, doing a 2-year phase-in would be appropriate. So what do we think about that? The ISO is proposing that we would do this administrative bifurcation of the TRR, where we talk about the first year, you're having 15% of the TRR collected under the 12 CP demand component of the TAC rate itself, and then 85% being collected under the volumetric. And then for the second year, we would do 30% under the peak demand rate and 70% under the volumetric rate. So, and then in year 3, we would actually just implement the full calculation proposal. So that's where we're proposing to go with this part of the phase-in approach that we wanted to propose for this this part of the draft final proposal. Any questions on this, Bert?
Bert Hansen, which year is year 1? Is it 2019?
So you mean when are we going to start implementing this? Yeah, that's a good question. So I think this is, a little bit later perhaps than some folks think we would implement this. Of course, we have to go through the approval from our board, which we are targeting for Q1 or Q2 of 2019. So, perhaps a little bit longer of a delay than some of our traditional stakeholder initiatives, but the thought there is that, we have a lot of other more pressing market design features that we're trying to get approved and implemented. And so, that's why we're pushing off the board decision on this for a little while. As far as the actual implementation goes, I think that's still up in the air for what year we would actually really implement this, but probably no sooner than 2021 or 2022 actually, because of the backlog of implementation stuff that we need to get through. The idea that we need to take this to FERC, and it could be a bit of a lengthy regulatory process, as some folks would probably remember with most of these rate case things. That can take a little while when you go through these, proceedings, and there's a lot of stuff like testimony and settlements, things that may occur. And so that's really where we are at that. And we do list the implementation timeframes in our annual roadmap. I forget the exact name of that, but yeah, so we talk about that in our 3-year policy roadmap, and then our release planning user group, I think they have the actual implementations that we're targeting. So that's kind of where we are with the implementation on that. Still more to come, I guess, on the final say on when that will be implemented. Go ahead, Brett.
Could it be implemented mid-year, or does it have to be January 1st of some year?
That's a good question. I think that it could potentially be done mid-year. I think it would probably take a bit of nuance as far as the way that the rates lined up, and it would maybe require even more a bit of a phase-in somehow to do that. I'm trying to think about it, but ultimately I guess that I think that the ISO would probably say we want this to be implemented starting at, January 1 of the beginning of a normal year, like every other traditional annual TAC process goes. So, pending the, time frame for the implementation, I think that could change, but I'd say it's pretty, we have pretty good confidence that we would want to do that starting, at the beginning of a normal traditional annual period, not during the middle of the year, just due to the complications that would be associated with that. Any other questions on the phase-in or timing of this? I think that's it. So, if there's nothing else, let me check with the operator and see if there's any question or comment online on the phone. Anything? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. That's Tom White again. The last part sounds just fine to me. I just wanted to correct a comment made a few minutes ago regarding the treatment in the planning process of PTO and non-PTO loads. I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty clear that in the transition planning process that the actual plan is based on the transmission level load, and on that basis, DER or energy efficiency included in that in both PTO and non-PTO units or areas are considered comparably. The way they can show it might be different, but the net effect is exactly the same. And we did see last year that the excess load reduction from DER resulted in $2.6 billion in projects being canceled by the ISO. And that's just the amount in excess of what was already counted on there, planned for on there.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's accurate to my understanding as well. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear through my comments, but yeah, so ultimately, we'd agree the ISO transmission planning process does take into account the DER, impacts of EE, and all those other, DER related, load modifying stuff. Anything that would reduce the load is taken into account. Perhaps it's done in a little bit different way for those different entities, as in, the ISO would probably get the gross load numbers and figures and then take those other inputs and assumptions out of that number for its planning for the traditional entities, and then similarly for the non-PTO entities, they would be really providing us with that already taken out. So ultimately, the net effect is the same. You're right. I think we'd agree with that. So sorry if I made that part a little bit confusing, but that really is the ultimate impact there. And then on your point about the reduction in transmission, that was the case. We did cancel a good number of projects due to we saw so much excess behind the meter and additional energy reducing the need there on the peak that was the driver for reducing the after we reevaluated the process, and so we actually believe that that's a good thing, and that the ISO is happy that the transmission plan was able to reflect that reduction in the needs and actually appropriately reduce the costs for ratepayers through that process. So we certainly do recognize that there is impacts from DER and all the other associated load modifiers that would have impacts to the overall needs, and that is important that we evaluate and reevaluate projects appropriately according to our normal approved transmission planning process, so that we're not building things we don't need to build. And so, the ISO is certainly very sensitive of the increasing TAC costs and increasing investment in facilities, and definitely recognize that there is a role for DER to play in reducing those costs. And that's something that we talked about, previously and ad nauseum, but, we still agree with a lot of the points that Clean Coalition has made on some of these impacts for future transmission costs, and that's where we ultimately landed with that aspect of the proposal. So just wanted to make a couple of those comments in response to you, Sam, but there's a couple other questions, I think, in the room, so I'm going to open it up to Jan, and then we can go back to Sam if he has any other thoughts.
I just want to add a little color to Sam's comment. There's no question that, distributed generation has changed the transmission planning landscape. But I think we have to be careful not to over-interpret what's going on or to associate directly certain dollars with certain things, because there's a lot of things going on at the same time. Customer response to Tier 2 and Tier 3 pricing, for example, really changes the amount of power people consume at different times. Things like, rate structures have a big impact on how customers respond. So you can't just point to one specific thing and say that's what triggered all of these savings. But no doubt there has been some, no question about it.
No, that's fair. And actually, in my own experience, I looked at my September usage last year was 60% higher than it was this year. So I don't know how I did that, but I must have left the washing machine running or something. But anyhow, that's a good point. I think that there's so many different moving parts and variables here. It just goes to the same thing as what we're talking about with some of this, with the actual impact analysis too. There's just so many things that are moving parts that you can't really apply one meaning or one impact to the outcomes. That there's like so many different things going on. So I think we definitely appreciate that point as well. But anyhow, okay, so with that, I think, I'd just like to take a moment before we wrap this whole thing up and just say, I want to say thanks to everyone for participating throughout this process. I know it's been a long, hard road of slogging through many hours of reading long proposals and at meetings and things like that and talking to different folks with widely differing opinions. So that's what this whole stakeholder process is all about, though, and I think, ultimately the ISO is very happy to have moved this proposal along to where it is today and appreciates all the input and feedback we've got from our stakeholders. And I think that ultimately this proposal would not have looked as good as it does today without the input from stakeholders. So I personally want to thank you, and the ISO thanks you all for your participation, and hope that you guys continue to participate as this goes through its FERC process. Anything else?
No, so, we know you all file long comments in support at FERC. So thank you.
Yeah, we expect thorough support at FERC now that we've gone through the stakeholder process. Yeah, you don't have to name me personally, but yeah. Doug, you want to have a closing remark as well?
Oh, of course. Thank you. I actually would like to reiterate that. Thank you, and thank everybody for what has been a very educational process. I think that I know we're not really taking up the issue of the TD interface point of measurement issue, although, I think we pointed out in our comments and sort of reiterate here that a little bit also to Jen's point too, that, this isn't a precise process, right? And so there's, on the one hand, there's been a lot of discussion about like, does this DER, this particular device contribute more or less than something else, may be a little beside the point, given that it is more of an art than a science. And that's just sort of one of the general, maybe I should back up. Many, if not all, of the criticisms of the point of measurement proposal apply with equal force to the hybrid proposal. And I think that's not to say that the hybrid proposal is bad, but rather one, we should consider how taking the same approach or arguments and applying them also to the point of measurement issue going forward. For example, certainly there are critiques that like, there's not a one-to-one correspondence. But then again, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between coincident peak demand and actual contribution to transmission spending, as we've discussed in some detail today. There are, critiques of, this is going to create a cost shift between one UDC area, depending on how much DG there is. But that's true of the demand, the 12CP hybrid approach too, right? That if you have behind-the-meter resources, you're going to be shifting costs around. It doesn't purely reflect historical cost drivers, but that's also true of the hybrid approach. And so I think it's worth re-examining a lot of those counter-arguments, as we go forward, to take a look at, like, how strongly do those apply to the point of measurement issue as well? Because I think they share a common characteristic that they represent an improvement on the status quo that isn't perfect. which in the world of rate design is like, maybe that's okay. And the last piece of it, actually wanted to extend an invite to everyone. Certainly, we've been talking with CAISO folks a fair bit about this notion that is in the report suggesting that the Utility Commission take up the idea of a comprehensive view of both transmission charges and the retail rates, how those all interact, because there is no entity that has jurisdiction over everything. So the Clean Coalition, our next step is going to be turning to the Utility Commission, kind of trying to get a successor proceeding, is how I think of it, to this one, launched, and would love to get feedback, love to get support, long, voluminous comments to CPUC in support of the proposal. So just so that you all know that that's what I'm going to be working on, and so I'll probably be reaching out to many, most of, or all of you, getting your thoughts again, and again, having a profound appreciation for this kind of stakeholder process of the dialogue that's happened here has improved, not only the hybrid proposal that Chris and folks have come up with, but also my understanding of the point of measurement proposal as well. That's evolved considerably over the last year thanks to everybody's input. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I think that's fair to say that there are a lot of the principles and issues that we raised in the discussion of point of measurement that do apply to the hybrid design, and there are those rate-making impacts that we have to consider. And ultimately, the ISO felt like there was a lot of support for one of those aspects and not the other, and that's where we landed. So, I think that's certainly fair to raise that point. And I will acknowledge that, the ISO does recognize that there's certainly impacts that you mentioned here that would apply, that we said were problematic for the point of measurement, that we are accepting as a given and part of the necessary implementation of the bifurcation and doing a hybrid billing determinant approach. So that's really where we landed on that one, and I think that ultimately is going to be decided upon by FERC through their proceeding if that's appropriate or not. But that's where the ISO believes that at this point we're on solid ground and have good stakeholder support for it. So there's that, and I do think that it's important to recognize that we did have a lot of important discussions throughout this process about the point of measurement. It's not just totally forgotten or anything like that. We've certainly developed our position on that, and as noted by Doug, we did say that we wanted the PUC to at least look at this issue and consider how it could align retail rates and LSC, incentives with this issue for future transmission use, because our board and the ISO management does agree that, this is an important issue to consider for future transmission development. So we'll keep that in mind as we go forward and observe this other proceeding that's happening, and perhaps, consider how we'll provide our input as well. One more comment here in the room. Paul?
Yeah, Paul with CLECA. It's been a long process on this and some great discussion. I've learned quite a bit from this process and appreciate everyone's involvement in it. Other aspects in the proposal that I don't like? Of course there are. Other aspects that I do like? Of course. I've seen you kind of say, you listened to us and you considered it in the big picture of, there's trade-offs in this between complexity and simplicity. But if we step back and kind of look at the thing as a whole, as someone who's done marginal cost estimates, to me, transmission is largely a capacity-related function that's been recovered on a volumetric basis for a decade. And we're finally moving to have something that's capacity-related. So just on that alone, the hybrid approach is a move forward. And, will this be is this the last word on this? Probably not. Maybe we might be back here again making refinements in a few years, because the usage of the grid is rapidly changing. And I do see this as changing, but I do appreciate everyone's involvement here, and I think you've done a great job on this.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate that. And we all appreciate the support and thoughts that you guys have provided. It's been really helpful. Again, just reiterating what I said before, but very helpful to help us develop this whole proposal. So I think we're in good shape with this. And like you said, I think most of the stakeholders would be happy to have at least a hybrid billing determinant approach, so we get some of that peak demand charge action going on in the future. And certainly, I think we will probably have to revisit things at some point, as we always do here at the ISO. Like we say, we always are, observing our current tariff and all the current processes that we have in place and seeing if there's ways to do them better. So we'll look forward to those discussions in the future. I can only hope that they take a long time to come to my doorstep, but it was a good process so far throughout this whole initiative. So thanks again, everyone, and I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy now to wrap us up with the next steps.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Just doing a last phone check for anyone on the lines. Operator, I don't believe we have any questions in the queue.
No, we do not.
Thanks. And thanks again, Chris and team, for a great, robust stakeholder process, and of course to you all, and reiterate what Bill said, looking forward to your supporting comments at FERC. So we appreciate it. Once more, comments due October 9th, and a reminder again for the daily briefing that the market notices will be cut off starting November 1st, and we'll be transitioning fully to the daily briefing at that time. Thanks again. So we're going to slowly start to add folks onto the daily briefing starting here in a month, I believe, but the cutoff from all market notices will be November 1st. We'll remove folks from market notices starting that date. So thanks again, folks, for coming, and please have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you to our speakers. Thank you all the audience for joining us today. The call has concluded, and you may now disconnect.